I'm Rick from Cartridge Classic Cars. On this video, we're back on the 69 Charger in the shop. It's been a little bit since we've done a video on this car. This thing's been waiting on parts for a little bit, and really off camera, we've done a lot of test fitting and modification of the factory sheet metal. We won't show it right now, but the whole rear of this car has been test fit. We've made modifications to the window channels, the rear corner caps and stuff like that, just because if you ever mess with these B Body cars, they are some of the hardest to fit around, how they're designed, how they're engineered. Now, saying that, none of this work is super easy, but what I like to do is really test fit all the sheet metal on the car, see what we got before we start welding stuff together. That goes for our wheel houses. That also includes what we're going to cover on this video, and that's the engine bay area. So the inner fenders, the supports up here, the radiator support. What we've done, we have test fit all this metal. So what we are going to do on this video is we took the test fitted metal off the car, and when I say test fit, I mean we put the fenders on the car, the hood on the car, the front chin spoiler, the lower valance area, and the grill insert for the Charger. Once we got everything where we wanted, we were able to mark and plan out where we're going to drill our holes, where we're going to use our spot welder. Since then, all the parts have been in the blast cabinet, sandblasted down to bare metal, and we added weld-through primer. Now, when we go on this part of the car, we can go ahead and start just fitting everything back in the same holes that we have, and in general, everything to make sure, you know, it should align. We are going to put the hood and fenders on one last time just to make sure everything is in the right spot before final welding. What we don't want, especially on any car really, is on the Mopars at least, when we set the inner fenders left and right, that sets where the hood hinges are, and that's going to set how far the hood is in adjustment left and right. So what we want to do, if we get our fenders aligned to our quarter panels and our doors and everything else, we know before we weld it, those parts should be in alignment and the hood should be able to come out straight. What we're worried about, if you got this over too far, then we got to pack a bunch of shims in the hood, or because it might be too far left and right, and then we might not be able to get it square right. So that's why I feel test fitting these cars, the in and out and the back and forth and throwing the parts on and taking them off is so important, and why sometimes it takes 4 or 5 times to put the parts together. I also like to make modifications and know where we stand. I'll show you. We have a problem with the passenger side fender on this car. We'll go over that later in the video just to make sure we're still having that issue. But again, the aftermarket stamping, they don't just bolt together. That's another reason why in this shop, and what we like to do, we like to completely assemble the whole car, front bumper to rear bumper. I know there's a bunch of other companies out there doing this, and what you'll do, GM car or a Mopar, you get the inner fenders on the car, radiator support, or if it's a GM F body or something, they just, you know, give you from the firewall back. Really, I feel the front end on these aftermarket parts with the fenders and everything are some of the hardest things to test fit versus the rear end. So what we want to take the aftermarket parts that are going to be on this car, we want to do all the metal work. So we know, like I said, when the customer gets it bumper to bumper, there should be no issues. We unbolt it, we seal it up, and then when the customer brings it to the body shop should also be able to just unbolt it and bolt it back in place, knowing everything's right. What would stink right now if we assemble this whole front end and the car looks good and find out something's not jiving right on the front end, something might not be square, and now this fender is curving over this way and the whole front end's crooked. You would never know that unless you put the fenders on. Or like I said, if there's an aftermarket problem with the sheet metal on the fenders, we want to handshake and fix everything in-house right here. So let's get to it. This should be a shorter video because we are going to just cover the engine bay on this video. We will come back to the doors and the rear sheet metal on a future video once we're done with the front end. Again, we want to get the front end where we're happy with it, and then when we final weld the rear end, same thing I was talking, we are are going off the final fitment on where the front sheet metal was. So when we weld the rear, again, everything is in general unison, working together, and then we can get down the road and gap it. So we're jumping ahead a little bit. Let's go to the actual part. We are gonna, like I said, everything's in bare metal, sandblasted, welded primers applied. We'll go ahead, test fit everything. I'm not gonna show you the initial fitment of the fenders and the hood, but then at the end of the video, we'll do a walk around where the hood and the fenders were on that final time. I will show you if we still having the issue with the passenger side fender, what we do as bad as the issue is, we have to address it now. What we're gonna do, how we're gonna fix it temporarily before the final gapping, and we will address that on camera too. So stay tuned. Let's get to fitting some sheet metal on this Charger. As we start installing all the front end sheet metal on this Charger, we are also, I didn't say it on the intro, going to be installing the USCAR tool, fender, stiffener, brace kit, and then the front USCAR tool lower radiator support. Now saying that, I am going to do the lower radiator support for the USCAR tool a little different than I believe even the manufacturer wants, but bear with me. We'll look at it, show you how I like to do it. I feel it looks a little bit cleaner and it doesn't compromise the structural integrity or anything right there. So what we're doing right now, the first thing I installed on this Charger is I put the shock towers in this car. I do have measurements initially where everything was taken to make sure everything is where the factory Charger would have been. I do like to try to kind of push both of the shock towers back a little bit more to increase the caster on these B body cars, especially since a lot of Mopars have a harder time getting the caster with the cam bolts. So that's what I did there. We took the measurements, everything, like I said, even with all the screw holes. I have my initial holes where everything's going to go on the inner fenders, everything, the radiator support, the top cross piece, and even where the hood hinge bracket supports up top are going to go. So we'll go ahead and just kind of put everything together back in those screw holes. We'll go ahead and check everything, make sure everything's squared left and right, make sure everything is looking good, and then we'll go ahead and bolt on all the parts, the sheet metal, the fenders, the hood. All this will be done off camera, and then we'll go ahead, once we verify everything is good, with our measurements and our external sheet metal, we'll go ahead and start welding this thing up. You can see once we get the inner fenders on, I do have the radiator support brackets going in. Now saying that, obviously the radiator support comes in two pieces. Usually there's an upper piece connected and the lower piece. We did disassemble this, and we are kind of putting our original part back on the car across the top front piece. So we're going to go ahead and just use whatever pieces we can that were somewhat salvageable. If you know this car, you know that there wasn't much left. If you haven't seen it yet, please go back and check out. I mean, really, this is almost, minus some inner structure pieces, a full build 1969 Charger. Like I said, we did save everything we could save on it, but that wasn't too much. So now that we got both sides of the radiator support screwed into place, we can turn our attention onto the cross piece of the radiator support. Like I said, if you're going to buy this and your whole radiator support was damaged, this would come in one piece. Now I am going to put the factory lower portion of the radiator support in this Charger. The reason I'm doing this is because the lower valance on this car bolts into the bottom of this radiator support. So like I said, when we go ahead and start test fitting the external sheet metal, we're going to go ahead and put the fenders and the hood and the front headlight support in there, and then we will bolt in the lower valance to this radiator support, making sure everything's in alignment and everything works. Then you'll see in the future we come back and we'll cut up this section and add the USCAR tool 1 accordingly. But like I said, most of these cars, I do like to put factory parts on them first, make sure everything does fit, and that goes with other models. If I have a factory wheelhouse, a lot of times before we cut out the mini tubs, I'll put the factory inner wheelhouse in a car, make sure everything does fit right in the factory position first. So we have a lot of inner wheelhouses that are factory on cars that we do all the time. And then once we can go ahead and we're done with that, we verify everything works, we can remove the factory outer wheelhouse out, and then know when we start cutting the mini tubs that
everything is right where it's supposed to be and nothing, is misaligned. Just because you cut so much on some of these mini tubs that we don't want to make sure that we're cutting something and we overlook some kind of curvature that was supposed to be there, or the height wasn't right, especially on the aftermarket stampings. So like I said a little bit ago, now off camera we did put all the sheet metal on the car. We did take our tram, we did measure everything, make sure we're within our tolerances and what we want to be at. And then we did go ahead and pull everything off this charger. So now we are going to start welding the whole complete inner structure of this car. Nothing on this car should move. I do like to start usually with how the parts I did assemble them initially, so we know we put the shock towers in the car. You kind of get in a rhythm here, and then we can just hopefully not miss anything. I mean, we are going to put this car in epoxy primer. If for some reason down the road we do end up missing something, we can just scuff that area up, clean that area with bare metal, and then come back and weld it. And then as we're epoxying something else on the car, we come back and just redust in that area. So saying that, the great thing about sandblasting all these parts and removing the E-coat on them is the welding process, I feel, comes out so much better. It goes a lot cleaner and a lot smoother. So in general too, with how this shop's set up here, we can usually strip and sandblast in our big giant sandblast cabinet all these parts a lot quicker than it would take us to even prep the edges of everything. So now we, instead of just sanding down with like a surface prep disc, a wire wheel or something on the edges, we could throw it in the blast cabinet, run through, have bare metal. We do push this process along though. Once we start building one of these cars, it's usually all hands on deck and gung-ho about building this part of the car to make sure we get everything sealed in epoxy primer before surface rust starts and everything else. Now, there is times that, and most of the time, we will come back through with a DA sander, some of the 180 soft sponges, and go over everything on the car after all the welds are sanded down before epoxy primer. What that's going to do, that's going to make sure, one, no surface rust has started on the car. Two, it's going to remove all the weld through primer you could see already on the car, ensuring the epoxy primer is on a fresh coat of bare metal. And then three, it really does clean up the welds and everything, and it gives us a chance to do a one over on the whole entire build. Just again what I talked about earlier, where we make sure we don't miss any welds. So now that the driver's side's done, we're going to go ahead and turn our attention on the passenger side. The bottom of these shock towers, this is certain things that we're doing on this Charger a little different, are usually stitch welded with little 1/2-inch stitch welds from the factory. We did weld them completely solid. Same thing with going around the perimeter on the front. I do put full welds on a lot of these suspension components, frame rails, stuff like that, to really increase the strength. I also want to point out around the shock tower, all the rosette holes that we are going to MIG up. We do in this shop add about twice as many welds, spot welds, MIG welds as most of the factory would. I feel the cars are built stronger, they're going to be a lot tougher, they're going to be quieter going down the road, and there's just multiple reasons that we're going to do this. It does create obviously a little bit more work for us and a lot more sanding, but again, the final product on these cars and everything else, I feel, is greatly improved versus even a factory car, with fitment, just how strong they are, and really how clean they look in the general aspect of everything. Another question I get asked all the time is, why we're MIG welding these areas versus, TIG welding. We do TIG welding service on external sheet metal. Really, even with impurities, the time it would take and everything else, the MIG welder is by far the superior choice, especially with the weld through primer. I could come back through there and clean out the weld through primer on every hole. Most of the time, that's also not cost efficient as far as time and energy, when I can just turn up the heat a little bit and you could see as we're welding, this weld through primer we're using isn't affected at all on the MIG welder. I'm using, just for my weld settings in general, I'm following the machine somewhat manufactured recommended settings. I do, like I said, turn the heat up a little bit, and I'm using 030 wire, and of course, non-flux core wire. That's the key. You don't want to be building these cars. You want to be using gas with argon, the shielding 101 carbon dioxide argon mix. So I think that's the best way to get the best welds on these cars. And then when you sand them down, most of these welds won't be seen. You're going to see right now, once we're done welding everything up, we take this in a process. So obviously the first step, sandblasting. Second step would be assembling the whole parts and everything else. And you could see on this radiator support, we did put the fenders back on. You could see it on the right and the left, and we are just verifying again, everything's still working right, everything's happy where it is. So these are the things that we are welding this part of the car up with the fenders itself on. Now that we remove the fenders, we can go ahead and actually weld on the the fender support brackets / where the hood hinges are going to bolt into, and those brackets are going to go in place. They do have some adjustments. So what we do, we obviously put the fender, the hood, everything on there. I make a mark, and then we're trying to get the bolt hole centered in those brackets. And what that's going to allow us to do is give us our right and a left tolerances and adjustments from there. So we, again, with this area, with the upper cowl, obviously if you saw in the past, that area was sealed off in epoxy primer already. We did that off the car before we assembled the cowl panel. So what we'll go ahead and do, I just cleaned up that area that those brackets are going to go on. To bare metal, we applied the weld through primer. If you could see the tone differences there. And then what we're going to do on this round, when we epoxy primer, we're going to DA, like I told you earlier, we DA sand everything where we're going to epoxy primer, and we are also going to DA scuff the top of the cowl panel and everywhere else this car had work, and put one more, possibly two more coats of epoxy on there too. So that's what we do in this shop. And then when you look at this car, you'll see it on the final walk around. Everything should blend real seamlessly, and really you won't be able to tell where we had our weld through primer, where we didn't. So as we're done welding, with our MIG welder, we'll come back through and we're going to use our belt sander. So there's many ways to do this, grinding rocks, you can use a surface prep disc, with like an 80 grit on it. I feel the belt sander for us works the best as far as getting in the spot welds. We can focus on just the weld itself, get the whole shock tower, everything cleaned up where we're not digging in or taking off too much metal. I am going to leave alone the welds going around the bottom perimeter and everything else like that, like the stitch welds. We are going to leave those exposed. I feel like the welds look really, clean and everything, so there's no reason to mess with them or try to make them any weaker. Now that we're done with all our MIG welds, cleaning all that up, we're going to take the next step in this process, and we're going to use the spot welder and finish spot welding all the areas that the spot welder can reach in. So you can see we're obviously going up, the back of the inner fenders to the inner fender to firewall brackets. What I'm doing, again, I'm putting twice as many spot welds. If someone doesn't want that, they can cover some of them up in the bodywork phase. But in general, again, we're not trying to hide originality on this car. We're not trying to fake it like it's an original car. So we'd rather build for strength and everything else, and adding more spot welds is an easy way to do that. Now what I am going to do too, I am putting the spot welder around the shock towers. That's going to allow us to, one, have a little bit more support, but it will look like the car hasn't been untouched in that area. So I just think with most of these Mopars, when you open the hood, the first thing you see is the spot welders in there, the spot welds. So I like to go ahead and just put that on there. Again, we're adding more welds. It's not hurting anything. So now that we got the shock towers, inner fender braces and everything, inner fenders welded together, we can turn to the shock tower upper brackets right here, because now the spot welder doesn't have to reach them. We are going to MIG weld them in. I could reach this with the spot welder, but there's no way I would feel comfortable about this brace holding on, going through 3 pieces of metal on my spot welder. And same thing with the top. I just feel like some of these certain structural pieces, I do like to MIG weld them, kind of like the shock towers too. I MIG welded all that, and then I'll come back through and just get it with the spot welder as a second piece. With those brackets, I didn't even bother, because you could see right now we are going to put the USCAR tool fender brace kit on the car. The first step is to clamp it in place. You are going to have not to clearance this thing and trim out the edges a little bit, you know, with a flap disc or something else like that. We use a cutoff wheel on certain edges. So this piece has been test fit in this car, you know, up and down 3 or 4 times, taking a little bit off each time, and you can see our tolerances are looking really good. What I did, I used some longer pairs of vice grips, and then I'm going to go ahead and tack weld the whole perimeter of this fender brace, you know, every couple inches or so. That ensures when I do start welding this completely that nothing's going to try to pull out, warp, move anything on the car. Everything's tight in there. Also, it allows me to remove all the vice grips and make sure, you know, nothing right there is in the way. With the welding, what I'm trying to do, I'm doing quick long stitches if I can. I'm going as far as I can, and I just know when we start putting too much heat in it, I'm just going to back off a hair just to make sure we don't blow all the way through. So saying that, with this B body, they do have that center slit cut out that goes to that shock tower to inner fender support brace on there, so that welds to the edge of that. So that's another thing you got to make sure you're lined up with this USCAR tool fender brace kit. As far as everything else welding, there's no rhyme or the reason, since everything's tacked in. Wherever I can get to it in a comfortable position, I'll go ahead and, you know, just start welding that area up, turning my attention to other areas, skip it around. Obviously, everything on this front area, as far as the cowl and inner fender brace and the shock tower brace, we're not worried about warping. So this isn't like doing external sheet metal. We got to do little tacks and, you know, take it real slow. We're going to put heat on this thing. The brace itself is holding the inner fender brace and everything together, so no worries there. Just one good solid weld. We're also, by doing that, we're making sure we don't miss anything. There's not any air bubbles in there. And saying that, down the road in the bodywork phase, usually I tell most people that a lot of times what I'd like to do in this area is just put a little seam sealer and get one of those corner pieces in there that you can just clean it up, do a little coat of seam sealer over the weld. So what I'm doing when we're welding this stuff, we're not cleaning off any of these welds here. You can, but I feel like you're making it weaker, chances of things popping through. And then, like I said, I think the seam sealer, when it's all said and done, looks just as clean. If I get a certain request that the owner doesn't want that, and I feel we can do that without hurting the structural integrity of the car, we can clean it up a little bit. But like I said, usually I recommend going that route as far as keeping it clean, and it'll match seam sealer anywhere else on the car. And again, the seam sealer has a multiple purpose job, stopping moisture and everything from getting in there. So it'll fill if we did have any impurities or you know, little pinholes in the MIG weld where we did miss something. The seam sealer would clean that out or fill that in where, you know, you're not trying to build rust or anything else like that. Another reason we do spray the epoxy beforehand is because a lot of the seam sealers do have to go in epoxy primer, and spraying epoxy primer in there will also make sure the epoxy primer is in any impurities or pinholes or anything else like that. Now that we're done with the USCAR tool fender braces, we are going to turn our attention to the USCAR tool front lower radiator support. So this is obviously a factory style piece that looks somewhat similar to the original, but does not have where the lower valance bolts on or that front bracket. So we'll remove those two pieces, and then what we're going to end up doing, we're going to remove this really flimsy, you know, 18 gauge lower radiator support. It's not really doing anything on the factory car. So what we'll do, we'll remove that, and then we're going to keep the pieces that aren't on the USCAR tool factory lower radiator support. What the directions say on USCAR tool or pictures that I've seen online, they want you to take their bracket right here and basically clamp it on top of the factory radiator support and just weld it completely in place. I feel that, one, it looks like a last minute add-on, you know, because that's what it is. You're basically leaving the factory car there, and it just doesn't look like, you know, it looks like it was kind of thrown into place on the car. So with this one, what we like to do, I think the the lightning holes in it, you know, where they punched in the dies and everything, they look really slick. We're going to let those come all the way through. This bracket obviously is more support than anything that 18 gauge was ever going to add on to it. So now that we have the top of the factory one in there, we can go ahead and tack up the USCAR tool one, and then we'll go ahead and weld this USCAR tool one completely to the factory, what's left of the factory lower radiator support. Like I said, I feel when you look at this and it's all welded up, cleaned up, ground down, it looks less obvious that it was an add-on piece. Obviously, anyone that knows these cars would know that this is 100% not a factory piece, and, you know, more of that, you know, extra bracing and all that. I mean, same thing with the inner fender braces there. I think they look really good. They're obviously, if you know anything about these B Body cars, would know that that is an add-on piece. However, I do strongly recommend all these braces from this company for anyone that really does want to drive these cars. I think they're really solid. They really do help with the handling and ride quality. I know we're jumping a bit ahead and we're in the paint booth. We're mixing an Omni MP 171 white epoxy primer, and we're putting that over the bare metal. I already told you the process on how we're DA sanding everything and just prepping everything down. I really can't show everything on this car. This video will be hours long. It's already dragging out really long right now, but what we did everything with the DA prep. We're going to do 2 coats of this Omni epoxy. You can see it's blending in really well. The white has a little bit harder coverage than the black would, of course, so we are on the second coat. I'll go a little bit heavier on that. So the first coat we just put on there, make sure we get good coverage and don't run. A good thing about doing 2 coats also, if for some reason you do miss a spot, the good chance is the second time you get in there and hit it with the second coat of epoxy primer. I do start with this engine bay, try not to box myself out, starting on the inside, then working my way outside. Now that the epoxy primer has completely cured for 3 days, I usually let the car sit around. We're going to pull it out of the paint booth, of course, and then now when we touch it, we don't have to worry about scratching it. This thing is like a protective shell on the whole front end of this car. That's going to allow us to go ahead and start bolting on the sheet metal for the final time. You saw we did pull the doors off on this car just to make sure we get enough epoxy primer sealed up behind the doors. There was no reason to pull the doors as far as aligning the front end or anything like that. This was just so we don't spray the doors and get overspray on them right now. Saying that, these doors, after the gapping phase, everything external sheet metal, including the fenders, the hood, the lower valance, will be completely stripped to bare metal and also be epoxy primered in white epoxy. However, we're not going to waste the owner's time, money, or anything else like that with the labor of doing that now, and then we have to come back through and start welding and gapping on them. Right now, we'll do all the gap work, all the welding work on there, pull them off, down the road, strip them, epoxy prime, and then final assembly, make sure everything goes together with no issues. So bolting on the sheet metal, as you can see, there's nothing super crazy about this. We're just sitting there. We've done it so many times. This B Body, I'm dreaming about this at night, putting this car together on and off with this external sheet metal. I've done it so much. So just putting this together, we start with the doors, get the fenders. I know about where the fenders got to go, and then we put this grill headlight assembly piece on the Charger, which kind of lines everything back up, and then we'll just take a couple measurements for our hood before we initially put our hood on, just to make sure, one, we're squared, centered, and the hood's going to fit really well. We are also going to put the lower valance on, set the lower fenders in there, make sure the lower valance does bolt into the lower new radiator support that we did install. You could see right here with that radiator support what I was talking about earlier. Now that's in epoxy primer, it just does, I feel, flow a little better looking at the car than just putting the piece over it. Again, do it how you want it, no judgment there. It's just how I personally like the way this looks in the shop. So you could see I'll usually, with the lower radiators or lower valance, make sure the center bolts work okay. We'll put the lower bolts in. And now, saying that, on this front end, everything as far as the fender bolts, I have 1 or 2 tightened down. and I'm mostly in the rear is more tightened down, but the front I have only one bolt tightened down, so I can sit there and handshake adjust everything. We're gonna go ahead and put the hood on this car and everything, and then the camera's gonna be cut off again, and there's gonna be a lot more camera work adjusting and just making sure everything lines up with the doors, with the quarters that are sitting on the car, everything in general, getting our widths, our hood gaps set, making sure we can move it, square everything up. All this takes a lot of time, and like I said, it's a lot of back and forth small motions to make sure the front end looks good on this car. My goal on this car too is to be able to do this and have everything where you don't have to pull on it, so when the car goes to the body shop or who's ever doing the body work on this car, because we aren't on this one, but whoever's doing the body work, that they can pull these parts on and bolt them back on without having to fight them. So us putting them on and off so many times with this front end designed around these aftermarket parts, this should be an easier process for someone to take care of. The final step on this Charger build, as far as the initial fitment of the front sheet metal, Chase and Megan are helping me, we're going to bolt on the hood. We'll close the hood, kind of what I told you a second ago. We're going to turn the cameras off, and I'm going to come back through this front end and just recheck everything, make sure everything's lined up and gapped the way we want it. I'm very happy. You could already see how the front fenders fit in. It's a lot better now that we knew what we want to address on the final fitment. So stay tuned. We're going to get this hood completely bolted on. I'm going to do some more work on the car, and we'll come back for a final walk around on this 69 Dodge Charger.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up this video on the front end install on the 1969 Charger. You saw in the paint booth, we put 2 coats of epoxy really over all the internal structure that we did, so the inner fenders. We did go back over the front firewall because we did a lot of welding on them. There was weld through primer on there. Same thing with this upper cowl. You know, from when we installed the upper cowl, if you remember on the last video, we did sandwich epoxy in there and then installed the upper cowl panel to the lower firewall with, you know, weld through primer, and then that was just left on there. So now everything on this area for now has been sealed up as far as, you know, the main structure of the Charger, and that goes everything front to rear minus the wheel tubs and everything. So I did tell you that will be on the next video with the quarter panels. They are, as you could see, the car is completely together minus the roof. You know, all the sheet metal has been test fit. The rear is pretty much 90% where we want to go. There is some fine tuning stuff that I will do on the rear, but we will address that in a future video. But as far as the front end, we got the front sheet metal bolted on. It is still in the E-coat. There is going to still need a lot of work, some work in the gapping phase. These parts don't fit really well. Right now, what we're doing with all the sheet metal is just putting it on the car and getting it where it's as close as we can get it. We did have to flatten out this hood. If you saw in other videos, the hood had too much curvature in it no matter how we adjusted the fender. So that's something I did want to address right now, because that does change the gapping from here to the front fenders. And again, what we're trying to do is get the whole front end on this car right, the doors on the car as close as we can, and then when we do our rear quarter panel install, we have a good reference on the front sheet metal where everything aligns. So we did do some fine tuning. I do have to get the hood stops on this car. You could say it's just kind of sitting there with a ratchet strap on the front, and we'll have to get the hood latch on it. But this car is starting to finally look like a 69 Charger compared to the other videos, and especially compared to what we started with the rust bucket and the status that it was in. So you can see we did put the front, you know, headlight, bezel support, grille, you know, inside grille assembly. The lower valance is on the car, and like I said, the fenders are fitting really good. What I did do, I did say on the intro that I was going to show you how we were going to cut this fender, and it is a little bit tight down here. However, the fender is a lot better now than it was on the first fitment. That's why we do multiple fitments on the car. I had everything on the front end where I thought it was really close, and then this time I knew what I wanted to do with the fender and kind of just adjusted on the front end a little bit, allowing me to get the fender enough that, like I said, it's probably gonna have to be gapped a little bit. The rear gapping on this door looks good. The front up here looks really good, but then when you look down the side, it gets a little bit tight. So we still have to do what we were planning on doing initially. However, last time when we did the initial fitment, we couldn't even open the door with this fender here. So now, doors open fine, everything's good. You could see, obviously, we don't have the door latches in them. And walking around this car, we also did have to work the hood hinges really bad. So we do have some metal work we're gonna have to smooth out on the hood, just being completely realistic with there, just trying to get everything settled down. The hood hinges were really off. I mean, there's no way to nice way to put them. They just did not close on this car. Initially, when we went to close it, the hood was about an inch too high. So we basically cut the whole bottom edge of the hood hinge, TIG welded it together to let the hinges come down a whole lot more. And then we basically slotted the hinges to let them drop down a lot further. And then what I'll end up doing, once everything's fit, and this will be in the final gapping stage, we'll go ahead and just finish up the hood hinges, add the extra supports and make everything blend, where unless you have a factory car right next to it, you're not going to realize, well, those hinges are really far down. It's just a profile and the ratio. We also cut the arm on this one right here, and that allowed the ratio to come back a little bit, and again, set in the car a little bit better. I know the aftermarket hood hinges, it's hit and miss sometimes. I know with the E-bodies, we have pretty good, they fit a little bit better. This is the first set of B Body hood hinges I've used that wasn't completely factory. And I really, with these, I was not a fan. Again, where we started with, that's not saying now we can't come up with a pretty close fitting hood. As you could see, the profile along the front cowl is really good. Around the fenders and the cowl looks really good too. We will have to move the cowl out a little bit on the doors or do the doors there. Like I said, this car will need gapping. We're well aware of that. Walking around the rest of the front end of this car, you could see the hood gaps going down the fenders in general looks really good. That side on the driver's side is a little bit tight at the top. I don't want to come out too much further on the door, so we might just go ahead and address that on the fender. Again, we'll show some of that on the gapping phase. But looking inside the engine bay, you can see everything's really clean with the epoxy primer. We spot welded most areas that we can get to, and a lot of areas that we did on the engine bay, you saw we did the MIG welder, and then we went back through with the spot welder. One, it's going to increase strength, and two, when you pop the hood on the car, it'll look like some of the car was not messed with. That's another reason, if you see on the bottom of the shock towers, I didn't grind the MIG welds, because if you ever see a factory car, it looks like that's how the factory put them on. So I try to replicate that as best I possibly can. Again, we're not hiding. This is obviously an aftermarket car, especially when you look under the fenders and, you know, like I said, in this inner fender area, and you see the USCAR tool fender braces on there, radiator support. And then I'll tell you right now, with the mini tubs, we already know that that's not factory. We're putting USCAR tool subframe connectors in this car, torque boxes, so this car's getting the whole works. Because like I said in a previous video, aftermarket drivetrain, I believe aftermarket suspension and everything. So again, we're just trying to replicate certain things. We're trying to build this car to the highest of quality. And I believe so far we are achieving that goal. It just takes patience and a little bit of effort and coming back and forth. Like I said, you see on these videos, a lot of times we'll only do one take, throw everything together. But even with putting the fenders and the hood on, I came back through off camera, and really once we had everything bolted together, started really fine tuning, adjusting, working the gaps, and just, again, getting that handshake of where all the sheet metal fits really well. And like I said, saying that, things are looking really good. Body lines are looking good. Like I said, we'll address the rear sheet metal of this car and what we already done off camera on the intro of the next video, and then we'll go ahead and start welding up the rear end. That will be real short. As far as timeline, I know it's been a while since we put a video out. We're just full force in these projects on these cars. This car was waiting on certain parts for a couple weeks here or there, and like I said, we did a lot of work off camera with fitting sheet metal, making sure everything's good. So when we do film these cars, everything just goes together. So stay tuned. Like I said, there'll be another video out on this car. We got 2 more projects in the shop that we're wrapping up and kind of just gonna do a big video on them, on all the work we did with the assembly and the final product. We're doing a lot of, you know, the walkarounds on the final product. We want everyone to see, you know, all the time and effort we put into the gap work and, you know, what comes out of our shop as far as, you know, the quality and what we can do if the owners allow us. So saying that, there's also a bunch of projects in this shop that we're not filming right now. There's a 70 CUDA behind us. That car is rock and rolling. We haven't done any filming on it, but again, really high quality build we're shooting for. Owners, great owner, dedicated to the build. So check out our Facebook page for the same process on what we're doing. What I'm trying to focus on in the YouTube right now is just new cars. You know, we've done a bunch of E-body cars in the past. That's not saying we're not doing them in the shop. We've done a bunch of Novas that we put on the channel. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna take a break of the same cars that we've been showing over and over again, and we get something new in the shop, we're gonna spend the time and film that. It's just, the filming obviously takes a lot of effort and time away from me at the shop and, you know, family and all that. So they said, just dedicating it to the cars that are new and original. We might show another E-body down the road sometime, you know, if the process changes a little bit. But as of right now, we're gonna hold off on the same cars that we've been repeating over. So I'm Rick from Cartridge Classic Cars. If you like this kind of stuff, please like, comment, and share the YouTube videos. We are gonna still put out the YouTube videos. There just might be a little bit spacing in between them. We're not going anywhere. Just bear with me. We're in the shop building cars all the time. So stay tuned for them, and I'll see you on the next video.